The house had been vacant for nearly a decade when Marcus and his girlfriend, Elise, decided to move in. Rent in their city was crushing, and when Elise's cousin offered them the old family home on Granger Street for free, as long as they were willing to fix it up, it seemed like a blessing. The house was big, much larger than they were used to. For bedrooms, creaky wood floors, and a wide basement that Elise warned was not in the best shape. The neighbors kept their distance when the couple moved in, watching silently from behind lace curtains, as though they knew something the two newcomers didn't. The couple laughed it off. Old houses had history, sure, but nothing they couldn't handle. The basement, however, carried a different presence. On their first night, Marcus ventured down with a flashlight, only to be met by a damp, metallic odor that clung to his clothes long after he came back up. The floor was concrete, cracked in jagged lines like veins, and the brick walls sweated with condensation. Rusted shelves leaned against one wall, filled with abandoned jars of nails, screws, and what looked like tiny animal bones. It just needs work, Marcus told himself. But as he stood there, light trembling against the damp walls, he had the distinct sensation that the shadows weren't entirely empty. He rushed back upstairs, locking the door behind him without thinking. Over the next few days, the house settled into its rhythms, pipes groaning, wood snapping, wind sliding through thin cracks. But the basement door became a silent centerpiece of their unease. Elise, who usually brushed off Marcus's nervousness, admitted she didn't like being near it. "It's colder there," she whispered once, after brushing her hand along the doorframe. She was right. The hallway could be warm, but the air around that door clung with an unnatural chill, as though the basement itself exhaled through the wood. Neither of them had spoken of it directly, but an unspoken agreement formed. They wouldn't go back down there unless they absolutely had to. On the fifth night, Marcus woke to a noise he couldn't place. Elise was still asleep beside him, her breathing soft and steady. The noise came again, a hollow thud, followed by a dragging scrape. It wasn't upstairs. It wasn't outside. It was beneath them, somewhere in the basement. He sat up, holding his breath, straining to hear. The scraping grew louder, as though someone, or something, was dragging heavy furniture across the floor below. Marcus whispered Elise's name, but she didn't stir. He didn't want to wake her, didn't want to explain what he'd heard until he was sure. Grabbing the baseball bat he'd left by the bed, he stepped quietly into the hallway. Each step a battle between logic and fear. The basement door stood ajar. He was certain they had locked it. From the crack, a thread of darkness seemed to spill out, thicker than the natural dark of the hall. The air carried that metallic stench again, stronger, fresher, as if the basement had been disturbed. Marcus tightened his grip on the bat, but he didn't go further. Instead, he closed the door, pressed his back against it, and listened. For a moment, silence. Then, faintly, a whisper, so soft he couldn't make out the words. He bolted back to the bedroom, forcing a smile when Elise stirred and asked what was wrong. "Just checking the locks," he lied. But as he lay back down, heart pounding, he knew something in the basement had been moving, something that wanted him to notice. The second month in the Halpern house marked the beginning of sleepless nights. Each knock that echoed down the hallway came with more weight, more deliberate intention. Lena started to notice a strange detail. The knocks always happened at the exact same time, 3:15 a.m., down to the minute. She checked her alarm clock, her phone, even the digital display on the microwave one night when she snuck downstairs. Every time, it was the same. At first, she thought maybe it was her parents playing tricks, maybe her brother sneaking around. But then she realized the knocks didn't come from hands. They were too hollow, too heavy, like something pressing bone against wood. One night, Lena dared herself to open the door. She waited, heart hammering in her chest, as the knocks began. 3 knocks. A pause. 2 knocks. Another pause. One final knock. Her hand trembled on the doorknob. When she twisted it open, the hallway was empty, except for the air. It was thicker, colder than the rest of the house. It clung to her skin and raised the hairs on the back of her neck. She whispered out a shaky hello. The silence that followed was so sharp, it hurt her ears. Then, faintly, she heard it, someone whispering her name from down the hall. She slammed the door shut and locked it, but the whispering didn't stop until dawn. Her father's resolve began to crack soon after. He was a practical man. the kind who believed in tools, not tales. But when he found the basement door standing wide open one morning, despite the fact that he had locked it with a chain the night before, his face grew pale. Dust had been disturbed along the concrete floor, forming faint tracks that didn't match anyone's shoes. The prints were long, thin, and strangely uneven, like something dragging its feet. He didn't tell the kids, but Lena overheard her parents arguing in the kitchen. Her mother wanted to move. Her father insisted it was just kids breaking in. But deep down, even he didn't believe that. Eric, the youngest, began acting strangely too. At dinner, he'd stop chewing and tilt his head, like he was listening to something far away. When Lena asked what he was doing, he said matter-of-factly, "They're talking again." His parents snapped at him to stop making things up, but Lena felt sick. Eric was too young to fake that kind of fear, and his eyes, wide, glassy, and distracted, looked like he was seeing something no one else could. At night, he started leaving his bedroom light on, refusing to sleep in the dark. Sometimes Lena would hear him whimpering through the wall that separated their rooms. By the third week, the Halperns could no longer deny that their lives had shifted into something unnatural. The whispers in the vents grew louder, sometimes laughing, sometimes chanting incoherently. The scratches in the walls seemed to crawl closer to their beds each night. And always, without fail, the knocks came at 3:15 a.m. Lena began to notice something even worse. The sequence of the knocks changed each night, as though forming some kind of code. But she didn't know what it meant. Not yet. The Halperns had avoided the attic since moving in. The narrow pull-down ladder was stiff with rust, and the air that seeped down through the hatch always smelled stale and earthy, like soil left too long in the rain. But after weeks of unexplained whispers, knocks, and dragging sounds overhead, it became impossible to ignore. One evening, fed up and determined, Mr. Halpern decided to check it himself. He climbed the ladder with a flashlight in hand, his kids watching nervously from below. When he pushed his head into the darkness, the air inside hit him like a wall, cold, damp, and so thick he had to swallow hard to keep his stomach from turning. The attic was empty, or at least it seemed that way at first. Just dust, boxes, and warped wooden beams. But as he swept the flashlight around, the beam caught something strange near the far corner. Deep grooves etched into the floorboards. They weren't scratches from mice or the scuff of old furniture. These were deliberate, claw-like marks, long and uneven, as though something had been pacing, circling in place. He crouched, shining the light closer, and realized the marks weren't just on the floor. They lined the walls too, trailing upward, disappearing into the rafters. The deeper he looked, the more his skin crawled. That night, Mr. Halpern didn't sleep. He sat at the kitchen table with his hands clenched, staring into nothing, while his wife tried to calm him. He wouldn't tell the children what he'd seen in the attic, but Lena caught a glimpse of his notepad before he shoved it away. He had written one word over and over, scrawled in angry, jagged pen strokes. Listen. The next day, he nailed the attic hatch shut. He told the family it was for safety, but Lena knew better. She had heard him whispering to her mother the night before. Something's up there. It's been up there for a long time. Meanwhile, Eric's behavior worsened. He started leaving drawings under his sister's door. Charcoal sketches of long-limbed figures with hollow eyes, standing in hallways or peering through vents. One morning, Lena found a drawing of her own bed, sketched perfectly down to the blanket pattern. A tall, faceless figure stood beside it. When she asked Eric why he drew it, he looked at her calmly and said, "Because that's who watches you." His voice was flat, detached, as though he was only repeating what he had been told. By the end of that week, the noises in the attic changed. No more faint scratching or pacing. Now, when the family sat in silence, they heard something heavier, like dragging footsteps crossing the length of the ceiling directly above them. Sometimes the sound would stop right over their heads, lingering, waiting. And worse still, Lena began to notice that the knocks at 3:15 had moved. They no longer came just from the hallway doors. Now they came from above, from the attic hatch, knocking downward. Now, the Halperns barely slept. The house had turned into a prison of noises and shadows, and the nights seemed to stretch longer than the days. At dinner, conversation had dwindled into silence, the clink of forks echoing like gunshots in the tense quiet. The parents were pale, hollow-eyed, their voices sharp and frayed. Eric seemed half here, half somewhere else, spending hours sitting at the foot of the stairs as if waiting for something. Lena carried exhaustion like a weight on her chest, her mind foggy, her every thought clouded by dread. Even the air in the house seemed heavy, as though it resented their presence. The knocks never stopped. 3:15 came each night like clockwork, and the sound, whether at the doors, the attic hatch, or the vents, always jolted the family into alertness. They tried ignoring it. They tried praying. They tried music to drown it out. Nothing worked. Worse, the whispers had become clearer. No longer random hisses in the vents. The voices now carried phrases. Sometimes Lena swore she heard her own name. Sometimes she heard her father's, repeated with an odd emphasis, like someone savoring the syllables. On the worst nights, the voices whispered in unison, a chorus of faint breaths weaving through the house's framework, saying things she could not bring herself to repeat. Point one morning, after another restless night, Mrs. Halpern snapped. She grabbed a broom handle and began slamming it against the ceiling, screaming at whatever was above them to leave them alone. The house fell silent afterward, and for a moment Lena thought maybe it had worked. But when she went upstairs to her room that night, she found a fresh set of scratches on the wall near her vent. They weren't there that morning. They weren't old. The gouges cut deep into the plaster, jagged, raw. She traced them with her finger and recoiled. The edges were warm, as though whatever had made them had only just done it. Sleep deprivation began twisting the family's grip on reality. Mr. Halpern started setting alarms at random hours, trying to confuse it, as he explained in a hushed voice, though he never said what it was. Mrs. Halpern began carrying rosary beads, whispering prayers under her breath even when she was cooking or folding laundry. Lena caught herself double-checking door locks 5-6 times before bed, her hands shaking, knowing deep down that locks didn't matter. And Eric began humming strange, tuneless melodies that made the air feel colder. When Lena begged him to stop, he simply looked at her and said, "They like it when I do that." Then came the night the house itself seemed to breathe. Lena awoke to the sound of her walls expanding and contracting, like lungs inhaling and exhaling. The floorboards shifted beneath her feet as she stood, and the shadows stretched unnaturally long, pooling in corners like liquid. And at exactly 3:15, the knocks began again. Only this time, they weren't just at her door. They were everywhere. On the walls, on the ceiling, on the floor beneath her bed. The sound of fists, too many to count, hammering from all directions at once. The breaking point came on a stormy night in late October. Rain lashed against the windows, the old gutters rattled, and the entire house shuddered with the weight of the wind. The Halperns huddled in the living room, unwilling to separate into their bedrooms after the last few weeks of torment. The television was on, but no one watched it. Its flickering glow only cast nervous shadows across the walls. Every so often, the family exchanged tense glances, each one waiting for the inevitable 3:15. But the house didn't wait for the hour. It began earlier. The whispers rose first, seeping from the vents like steam. They weren't random anymore. They weren't even quiet. They carried words that were harsh, guttural, foreign, and yet, woven between them, Lena heard something terrifyingly clear. "We are here." The family froze. Then the lights flickered. The television screen warped, the image stretching and twisting until it cut to static. The hum of electricity filled the house, growing louder, building into a pressure that made their ears ache. And then it stepped forward. From the corner of the living room, where the lamplight barely reached, a shape shifted against the wall. At first it looked like a shadow, just a trick of the stormlight. But when Lena's eyes adjusted, she realized the darkness had form. Too tall, too thin, its limbs bending slightly wrong, as if its joints weren't made for human movement. It didn't walk. It stretched. Each step seemed to pull it forward unnaturally, the way something would move if it had never learned how to be a person. Eric gasped before anyone else could react. "That's the one," he whispered, his small voice cutting through the static. "That's who talks to me." The entity paused at that, its faceless head tilting slowly, acknowledging him. Lena's mother clutched her rosary and began to pray, her words tumbling out frantically. Her father grabbed a fireplace poker, brandishing it like a weapon, though his hands trembled violently. But none of it mattered. The figure wasn't deterred. Instead, it stepped closer, the air around it bending, the lights dimming until the only thing visible was its silhouette, blacker than the shadows it came from. The house groaned as though straining under the weight of its presence. Lena's chest tightened, her vision tunneling, her ears filled with the sound of ragged breathing. Yet no one in the room was making that sound. The figure reached the center of the living room and stopped, inches from the circle of light cast by the single working lamp. It lifted one impossibly long hand and pressed it against the wall. The plaster cracked under its touch. And then, without warning, every window in the house slammed open at once, the storm roaring inside, and the whispers surged so loudly that it sounded like screams. The morning after the dream, Megan woke with the uneasy sensation that her room was smaller than it had been before, the walls just a fraction closer. Her porthole window, usually streaked with spray, was perfectly clean, so clean it reflected her face like a mirror. When she looked into it, for the briefest second, she thought she saw someone standing directly behind her. She spun around, but the cabin was empty. Her unease grew heavier by the hour. She couldn't shake the man's words from the previous day. "You're in my cabin." Determined to learn the truth, she sought out Helen in the library. The older woman's knitting needles clicked rapidly as Megan asked if she knew anything about Cabin 743. Helen hesitated before lowering her voice. "There are stories," she said. "A man died in that room. Some say he jumped from the deck. Others say he never left at all." Megan pressed her for details, but Helen only shook her head. "The crew won't talk about it. Not officially. They scrub the passenger lists every year, but sometimes things slip through." She slid a folded piece of paper across the table. "I kept this from a cruise years ago. Same ship. Look at the names." When Megan unfolded the paper, her stomach tightened. It was a photocopy of an old passenger list, dated exactly 3 years prior. Most of the names were blurred from the copy, but one stood out in sharp, bold print. Daniel Crow, Cabin 743. In the column marked Disembarked, his entry was blank. Megan ran her finger down the list twice, hoping she'd missed it, but there was no departure record. When she looked up, Helen's eyes were glassy. "He never checked out," Helen whispered. "And neither did the girl who had that room before you." That night, as the ship rocked gently on the dark water, an announcement blared over the intercom, the kind that instantly quieted every conversation on board. "Attention all passengers. If anyone has seen Ms. Laura Bennett, please contact guest services immediately." Murmurs swept through the hallways. Megan didn't know the name, but her chest tightened anyway. Later, she overheard 2 crew members whispering near the stairwell. "She was last seen near the aft deck," one said. "Security says the cameras glitched again." The other just muttered, "It's happening again." Before walking off quickly, in the early hours of the morning, Megan awoke to the sensation of the mattress shifting, as if someone had just sat down beside her. She kept her eyes closed, paralyzed, every muscle rigid. A moment later, a cold fingertip brushed her wrist, and a man's voice whispered near her ear, "You need to leave." After the priest's unsettling words, the Halperns knew they couldn't stay. Within 2 days, they had packed up again and driven hundreds of miles to Lena's aunt's house in another state. The aunt welcomed them kindly, but the tension in the family was obvious. They barely spoke, jumped at every sound, and refused to sleep in separate rooms. Lena tried to convince herself that the distance would matter, that whatever had attached itself to them had limits. She wanted to believe that leaving the house, and now the town, was the end of it. For the first time in months, she dared to close her eyes without listening for whispers. That hope shattered on the very first night. Her aunt's home was warm and brightly lit, with the smell of fresh bread in the air. It felt safe, until the clock in the hallway chimed once, softly, at 3:15. Lena sat upright instantly, her pulse hammering. A second later, she heard it. 3 knocks, clear and deliberate, against her bedroom door. Her aunt didn't own an old house. There were no hollow pipes, no rotting wood. Yet the sound was unmistakable. Her mother clutched her rosary tighter. Her father grabbed her arm and whispered harshly, "Don't open it." Not this time. The knocking continued until dawn. The following days spiraled into paranoia. Doors opened by themselves. Shadows pooled unnaturally in corners, even during the day. Eric began wandering at night, sleepwalking through the halls, muttering to someone who wasn't there. When asked what he was saying, he shrugged like it was obvious. I'm answering them. The aunt begged them to explain what was happening, but every time they tried, the words seemed hollow. How could anyone believe them? Worse, the aunt's dog began refusing to enter the rooms where the family slept, growling low at unseen corners that on the fifth night, it escalated. Lena woke to the sound of breathing, not whispers, not knocks, but heavy, ragged inhaling directly above her. She froze, too afraid to move. The weight of something unseen pressed the mattress beside her, sinking it as though someone were sitting there. She could feel the warmth of it, the pull of the blanket shifting. When she finally forced her eyes open, she saw the silhouette, blacker than the dark, crouched beside her bed. No face, no eyes, just presence. She screamed, and the lights in the entire house blew out at once. By morning, her aunt insisted they leave. She didn't need an explanation. She had seen enough. The family loaded back into their van, silent, defeated. They had driven hundreds of miles to escape, and it had found them anyway. As Lena stared out the window at the passing countryside, she realized a chilling truth. The house had never been haunted. They were. The Halperns returned home not because they wanted to, but because they had nowhere else left to go. Friends had turned them away with polite excuses. Relatives stopped answering calls. Even the aunt who had sheltered them wouldn't pick up the phone. By now, the family carried an air of sickness, pale, hollow-eyed, paranoid. Wherever they went, the presence followed, and others could feel it too, even if they couldn't see it. The Halperns were alone. So they went back to the corner house that had started it all, as if surrendering to what they could no longer escape. The first night back was the worst. Lena lay in bed with her lamp on, gripping her blanket like a lifeline. At 3:15, the knocks came, not at the door, but beneath her bed. The wooden frame rattled violently, shaking her mattress. She cried out, and her parents burst in to find her bed sliding inches across the floor, dragging against the carpet as though pulled by invisible hands. When her father grabbed the frame to stop it, something unseen slammed him back against the wall with such force that a picture frame shattered to the floor. His shoulder hung at an odd angle, dislocated. That was the moment they realized it could touch them. The entity was no longer confined to whispers or scratches in the walls. It had weight, strength, intent, and soon it grew bolder. During the day, Lena would feel invisible fingers comb slowly through her hair, tugging strands hard enough to rip some free. Eric developed long red scratches down his arms and back, though no one ever saw him make them. Her mother began waking with bruises on her wrists, as though restrained by unseen hands. They documented everything, taking pictures, filming, even contacting the police once. But the officers found nothing, only warning them that making false reports could lead to trouble. The physical torment was only part of it. The entity wanted them exhausted, broken, unable to resist. It manipulated the house itself, slamming doors, rattling windows, cutting the power. On one occasion, while Lena was brushing her teeth, the bathroom mirror fogged over despite no hot water running. Slowly, words etched themselves into the condensation, letters forming one after another. Open the door. Her scream drew the family, but by the time they arrived, the mirror was clear, spotless, as though nothing had ever been written there. The worst came one night when Eric vanished from his bed. Panic erupted as the family tore through the house, calling his name. They found him in the attic, despite the hatch being nailed shut, sitting cross-legged in the dust, eyes glazed, whispering in a language none of them understood. His hands bled where long splinters had embedded in his skin. When his father pulled him down the ladder, Eric went limp, as if unconscious, only to suddenly smile once they reached the living room. "It says we're almost ready," he whispered. Then he fainted, leaving his parents and sister trembling in silence. After Eric's disappearance into the attic, the Halperns knew they couldn't face this thing alone anymore. Conventional help had failed them. Priests, police, even family. In desperation, Mr. Halpern reached out to a group of paranormal investigators he found online, the kind who advertised in fringe forums and claimed to remove attachments. They arrived 2 nights later, a mismatched trio carrying cameras, recorders, and bundles of strange herbs. At first, the family felt a spark of hope. These people believed them. They knew. But the moment the investigators stepped inside, that hope curdled into fear. The lead investigator, a gaunt man with dark circles under his eyes, barely crossed the threshold before whispering, "It's already claimed this place." His two partners set up quickly, motion detectors in the hallways, cameras in every corner, recorders near the vents. They lit candles, burned sage, and began chanting in low voices. The Halperns watched from the living room, huddled together, as the atmosphere thickened. The air grew damp, heavy, the walls groaning as though resisting the intrusion. The equipment flickered wildly, red lights flashing, static screaming through the speakers. Then, from the recorder nearest the attic hatch, a voice hissed through, "You shouldn't have brought them here." The entity made its presence known almost immediately. Doors slammed shut in sequence, upstairs first, then the kitchen, then the bathroom. The floorboards shook as footsteps raced through the halls, faster than any human could move. The investigators tried to keep chanting, but their voices wavered as one of the cameras toppled violently, shattering against the floor. One of them, the youngest, bolted for the door, muttering, "Nope, no, I'm not dying here," before fleeing into the night. The gaunt leader cursed and told the family to hold on, but his words sounded hollow even to him. Then Eric began to convulse. He writhed on the floor, his small body arching in unnatural angles, his eyes rolling back. His voice, no longer his own, poured out in guttural syllables, layered as if multiple people were speaking through him at once. The words echoed, vibrating in the walls, shaking dust from the ceiling. His mother tried to grab him, but the lead investigator shouted, "Don't touch him," before resuming his frantic chant. Suddenly, Eric went still. His eyes snapped forward, black and glassy, and he smiled. "You invited it," he whispered, his voice chillingly calm. "Now it doesn't have to hide." The house erupted. Every candle blew out, plunging them into near darkness. The investigators' remaining equipment sparked and died. And in the silence that followed, a knock echoed, not from the walls, not from the attic, but from inside the living room itself. Wood splintered as deep cracks crawled up the walls, forming jagged, unnatural shapes. The gaunt investigator dropped his ritual tools and whispered to no one in particular. "We didn't banish it. We gave it form." The investigators were gone by morning. Two had fled in the night, abandoning their equipment, while the gaunt leader lingered only long enough to whisper a warning. "It's stronger now. It doesn't need the house anymore." Then he left, slamming the door behind him. The Halperns were alone again. But something had changed. The entity was no longer shy, no longer content to whisper and scratch. It moved freely now, and the family felt it with every breath. Rooms grew colder as they entered. Lights dimmed. Shadows stretched along the floor, reaching for them like fingers. That evening, as dusk bled into night, Lena begged her parents to leave one last time. "We can't," her father said, voice breaking. "It's not the house. It's us." They stayed together in the living room, too afraid to scatter. 3:15 arrived, and with it, the sound that had haunted them for months, the knocks. But this time, they weren't patient, rhythmic taps. They were violent, thunderous pounds that shook the walls, rattled the furniture, and cracked the ceiling. The air grew heavy, crushing, until it felt like the house itself was collapsing inward. Then the attic hatch burst open, with splintering, as something massive crawled out. It was no longer just a shadow. The figure towered in the living room, its form writhing and unstable, as though it was made from darkness itself. Its limbs bent and broke as it moved, stretching too far, snapping back, reshaping itself. It filled the space with a suffocating presence, blotting out the lamplight. Lena clutched Eric, who trembled in her arms, while her mother prayed frantically and her father gripped the fireplace poker with white knuckles. But deep down, they all knew there was no fighting it. The thing wasn't in their house. It was their house. It had been growing, feeding, waiting. The entity reached for Eric first. The boy's eyes glazed, his mouth twisting into that same unnatural smile. "It chose me," he whispered, his voice layered with something not his own. His body began to lift from Lena's arms, drawn toward the darkness like a puppet on strings. His father lunged, dragging him back, screaming in rage. The creature recoiled, the walls trembling as it shrieked without sound, an explosion of pressure that shattered every window in the house. Glass rained down as the family huddled together, refusing to let Eric go. For the first time, the entity faltered. In that moment of chaos, Lena grabbed her mother's rosary from the floor and pressed it against Eric's chest. The boy screamed, not in pain, but as though two voices were warring inside him. The house howled, the walls buckling outward, the ceiling caving in. A blinding light erupted from the cracks in the plaster, searing through the darkness. And then, silence. The entity collapsed inward, sucked back into the very foundation, leaving only the wreckage of the house groaning around them. The Halperns escaped into the street barefoot, bloodied and trembling, clutching one another beneath the cold starlight. Behind them, their house sagged, windows shattered, walls scorched as though burned from the inside out. Emergency sirens wailed in the distance, but none of them looked back. They never returned, and the house was condemned within weeks. Neighbors swore it should have been demolished, yet it still stands, empty, rotting, the attic hatch hanging loose. Locals say you can hear knocking there at night, always at 3:15. The Halperns never spoke publicly of what happened. But Lena, years later, admitted one thing. She still hears the whispers sometimes, no matter where she goes.